Thanks for the invitation. So having said that, I have to tell you also, I've never been part of a field called migration studies, but I have been studying it, taking it as an object. So what I'll say today may be experienced as an objectification, or perhaps even as a provocation, because I would prefer not to accept the commonsensical or even the common scientific meaning of the concept of migration. So this is what I'm going to talk about today. Maybe not so much the concept of migrant integration, which I guess we'll get into tomorrow, but more the concept of migration. So if a natural scientist were to come here and in this room and conclude her explorations of what she finds in this room by assuming that it consists of tables and chairs, we would likely be disappointed for her not moving beyond common sense and prima facie experiences or appearances. But yet here we are as social scientists, and we are very used to taking on board commonsensical political and policy concepts such as nation state, the border, migration, and the economy. So if I try to remain from doing so and sort of bracket all of these concepts for a moment, I realize it might be somewhat of a provocation, and I hope it helps if I say it's really meant as an irritation, in the sense in which Niklas Luhmann uses that concept as a kind of productive confrontation with complexity that may or may not inspire to change the system's habits. And what I say today comes out of a close collaboration with my friend and colleague Rogier van Wekem, and it should be really attributed to both of us. This I'm obviously saying in order to share the blame. So the question organizing my talk today is, how does migration studies have its object, or how does migration become an object that is then available to a variety of publics? Perhaps you're tempted to answer that it first of all takes people that migrate. But whether the movement of a body gets to be migration is not in the hands of that body. And many who don't move are even counted as migrants. As those of you involved in the standardization of migration statistics will know well, migration is not simply people moving from one place to another. One cannot be a migrant, one can be counted as a migrant. And one can be interpolated as a migrant, obviously to the degree that many people come to see themselves as migrants and are proud of this, and this is something I in no way wish to dispute or denounce. But migration really only comes into view, well, when it comes into view. It occurs when people's mobility is captured by an official apparatus of registration. An official here first and foremost means state, but state actors operate in tandem with others, including social scientists, in visualizing migration. And what I'm saying is that the visualizing is the constitution. Migration is the accounting according to which these and these bodies, originally from this territory, are now in that territory. But of course, the territories do not pre-exist the phenomenon of migration, because this kind of visualization is today a primary way in which the imaginary objects we call nation states gain credibility. What is more, migration accounting is an accounting that not only makes claims about the bodies of those who it counts as migrants, it is always, and at the same time, a practice that gives an account of its own situatedness. It is from here, from this being in place, that those who come from there, those who are out of place, can be counted. I think the analogy with birds is enlightening here. Representations of human migration and bird migration often look very similar. And they are often flow charts that have meteorological origins. This is a famous, the first ever flow chart. This is Edmund Halley's map of the trade winds from 1686. And these kinds of maps, which we know now in migration studies, of course, they're made famous as maps of invasions, such as Minard's 1812 map of Napoleon's invasion of Russia. And Ravenstein was probably the first to apply flow charts to migration, and he did so in 1885. But maps of migrating birds and humans are treated in entirely different ways, because the registration of birds and humans is very different. When birds are said to migrate, they do not go from a place of belonging to a place of non-belonging. Their migration is the enactment of the extended topology that is their habitat. So their belonging is completely dispersed, and wherever they go, they belong. Humans may think otherwise. For instance, when the godwit is chosen as the archetypical Dutch national bird, I believe the Polish name is Ryczyk Czarnogoniaszki. Please forgive me for that. So the point is that this Dutch bird supposedly migrates, and those frequenting the Netherlands spend half their time in Africa. This is actually the distribution of the so-called Dutch national bird. So it seems to me that this idea that where a body is, it simply is, makes perfect sense. Only once nation states are conjured up does it seem logical to assume that bodies can be in but not of a place, and that they not simply are where they are, but that there's something wrong with where they are, that they are not really there, that they belong elsewhere, that they should move on or go back, or that they should first integrate before they have really arrived where they are already located. So, with the migration of birds, the reference space is Earth. And with people, the reference space is the international system of nation states. So only after we sign up to support nation states bounded by borders can we have the facts about migration. And this investment in the nation state is implicit in migration studies, but it's a very consequential and I think problematic investment for any scientific approach to whatever migration would be. Now, a key role is played by standardization here. The 1924 International Conference on Immigration and Immigration in Rome adopted the first standard definitions of migration. And among the first institutions to standardize migration was the International Labor Office, which was primarily interested in charting migration because of its consequences for employment, for labor. There continue to be all kinds of problems of standardization. But the point is that the very effort at standardization already creates the thing to be standardized, if only as a thing to be concerned with, to be standardized and regulated, a thing that is therefore, for all practical purposes, assumed to exist and to precede its standardization. In other words, in the very effort to render things comparable, there is already the assumption of comparability, the assumption that these things are of the same kind. And so the facts about migration are in a way much less consequential than the ongoing production of the fact of migration, a production that draws together various state actors and social scientists and other accountants, data, technologies, bodies, and territories. So migration is born out of states' desires for regulation, capital's desires for labor differentiation, and statisticians' desires for comparison, but it is born in a very specific context. In Europe, migration only really starts to become an issue after the demise of empire. This is when the very language of migration only emerges. So to speak of migration in the 15th century is a complete anachronism. In their time, European colonial settlers were not called or counted as migrants. The moment migrants become a matter of concern is the moment that colonial empire reaches its tipping point. And when that happens, all the ways in which these migrants were always already entangled with Europe become invisibilized. So migration becomes a concern when movement is potentially reversed, when Europe becomes receiving country. And the end of empire also marks the birth of European unification with 1957, with the Ghanaian independence and the Treaty of Rome as a kind of symbolic marker. But European unification was from the start conceived as a neo-colonial project that should assure access to African resources as a form of development. In their book, Eurafrica, P.O. Hansen and Stephen Johnson quote the chairman of the Economic Committee of the Council of Europe in 1952, Paul Reynaud, who said, "We must also, if free Europe is to be made viable, jointly exploit the riches of the African continent and try to find there those raw materials which we are getting from the dollar area and for which we are unable to pay." But the flip side of the project of Eurafrica was that it would be impossible not to contribute to the mobility of Africans towards Europe. So this dynamic of empire already structures the early work of Ravenstein, in which the dynamic of the metropolis, the imperial organizing center of all movement for Ravenstein, is such that ultimately, as he says, the attractive force of one of our rapidly increasing cities makes its influence felt to the most remote corner of the empire. So I think the crucial pivot that migration enacts the moment European imperialism reaches its tipping point is one that moves from forms of dispersal, in this case conquest and settler colonialism, to the possibility of forms of relocation, wherein populations cross a colonial divide and the concomitant global color lines. Or in Marxist terms, the flow of constant capital would now accompany a flow of variable capital of workers. And so migration became a priority object of policy in European countries. So migration really marks the continuing presence of a colonial divide. It is under conditions of the loss of direct colonial dominance, and specifically with respect to the recomposition of global labor, that it becomes relevant to keep track of who goes where, who can and cannot move, who belongs where, or in other words, which blood is connected with which soil. So that's how migration historically arises as an object of concern. Now, what is the organizing logic of this administration of people and labor? And the key point here, I think, is that from this administrative point of view, migration comes to diminish with each migrant counted a world in which migration didn't happen. This is the key point. Migration is enacted through a double accounting that sets off actual lives against the number of lives that would have been counted were migration not to have happened. In other words, what is a migrant? A migrant is someone who might not have been here. This is how migration counts migrants. And a first effect that this has is to enact a kind of temporal bifurcation. While we know that we in fact coexist here and now, we produce facts about this togetherness by quite literally archiving and keeping present an unrealized timeline in which migration didn't happen. This is accounted for as the settled natural population. And the second effect is that these natives now have to live with the addition of those who are marked as migrants. That is, migration requires certain sacrifices. Migration will cost something. In the language of economics, migration presents a native population with an opportunity cost. The benefits that would have accrued to the nation in the absence of migration. Benefits that are now missed out on. It constitutes a deviation from the normalcy of a population keeping to itself. A disappointing deviation from the counterfactual scenario of no migration. You could also say it's a costly refutation of a null hypothesis of a nation without migration. In other words, migration is a modality of debt. This debt equals the costs incurred by the nation in the absence of the scenario no migration. So, qua accounting, migration inscribes with each count some outstanding debt to be settled, some opportunity cost or loss to be compensated. And while this loss is the loss of a completely counterfactual situation, a situation that did not happen, a situation one might call the native scenario, a scenario of an imagined, untainted whiteness, the loss is nonetheless very real in its consequences. So migration politics can be seen as the history of controversies, interventions and resolutions that coalesce around the indebtedness of the migrants and the management of the native demand to be satisfied. And any accounting of migration introduces this question of indebtedness. Because this relationality could have only been registered and verified and visualized through an administrative contrast between a world in which migration did happen and one in which it did not happen. And all of this plays out in both a moral economy of migration and in a money economy. And I guess the most acute example of a moral economy of migration is the question of gratitude. In her study of Somali refugee settlement in Maine in the US, Catherine Westerman describes the politics of gratitude when she says, a common question from the audience at public presentations offered by Somalis to explain their history is, are you grateful to be here? People have suggested to me that Somalis should publish thank you letters in the local newspapers to let other Lewiston residents know how grateful they are. Migration requires an asymmetrical and continued repair of loss. And that ties into the emergence of notions of earned citizenship in various European countries and of the need for enculturation programs. Not only is presence something to be earned, which means to repair some loss at the side of a native public, but the performance of effort on the side of migrants, for instance, by completing an enculturation course, is significant precisely because it indicates a recognition of and submission to the relationality of debt. I guess that's why critiques of such enculturation programs as assimilationist, while not necessarily wrong, tend to fall short in recognizing that it's simply the performance that counts. Central is the effort, which is an equivalent to the payment of a debt, an investment that the migrants needs to be seen to make. But time is money, so while these two examples illustrate how indebtedness plays out in terms of a moral economy, migration as debt is also at play as a money economy. The cost of migration is widely present in research programs and controversies over the fiscal sustainability of public spending and in the distributive effects on households and enterprises and so on. And there are all kinds of attempts to perform actual calculations of the monetary cost of migration, and they turn out to be exceedingly complex. But economists, when they do so, they typically capitalize on what are often called natural experiments to stand in for the speculative conception of the problem. So they seek out a chance event, some chance occurrence, against which to offset the native scenario, the scenario without migration, to compare the sudden influx of migrant workers with the situation where no migrant workers would have appeared. And famously, for instance, the 1980 Mariel boat lift and the influx of Cuban migrants in the US is the example that economists often hark back to. So in the ways economists measure the costs of migration, we can observe that the reference to any fact about migration's costs must be made by offsetting measurable effects against the non-occurrence of migration. So there is another discourse that surfaces in the economics of migration. Posner and Weil, for instance, propose that poorer citizens of wealthy countries rent migrants so as to assure these citizens consent to a global project of alleviating poverty, and in the process to provide them with benefits in the form of a new system of indentured labor. They literally speak of a caste system. And in this scheme, migrants' rights would be curtailed so as to continue to signify white superiority in this system of what is framed in humanitarian rhetoric as patronage. The work of former World Bank chief economist Branko Milanovic similarly entails the actual settling of accounts by way of proposals for differential wages between natives and migrants. In excess of existing calls for a hostile environment and a sober reception regime, Milanovic envisages the actual setting of asymmetric rights and wages. And his main concern is with the poorest people in the richest countries, whom he considers the real losers of globalization, since, relatively speaking, migrants have a much higher income increase to win. So, curtailing rights and wages of migrants would assuage the concerns of the native population, Milanovic writes, while still ensuring the migrants are better off than they would be if they had stayed in their own countries. And this quelling of white rage, of native rage, is a key element of the economy of migration. Implied also in Posner and Weil's proposal is that it both accommodates and prevents potential white rage over migration by turning the presence of migrants into directly commodifiable availability, and by adding direct economic benefits plus the psychological wage of a white patronage that can observe itself as humanitarian compassion. Now, in practice, the moral economy and the money economy of migration are entangled. Milanovic, for instance, recognizes the slim effect that migration has on wages. But he then continues to balance, in the same maneuver, economic factors and the preservation of cultural norms. And one option that he offers is to make immigrants pay higher taxes. So to make immigrants pay higher taxes than natives in a host country. And as Gurminder Bambra aptly concludes about this, notice that the world's poorest are asked to pay taxation to support those within the 75th to 90th percentile. But I think that this is entirely consistent with the logic of debt that organizes migration as an economy. Migration is this way of settling accounts. As a final example, I want to mention Wolfgang Strix, the political sociologist Wolfgang Strix, take on immigration policy, which deals indeed literally with the question, as he puts it, how are facts construed to fit, justify, and make appear possible moral or economic practices, or how are economic practices defended as moral ones. And on the credit side of his equation, cultural fragmentation, segregation, and conflicts between altruists and egoists all add up. But they are balanced on the debit side by the opportunity, as he says, in an age of economism and technocracy to demonstrate unconditional compassion. Here's a quote from Strix. As he says, even economists emphasize the importance of morality in these matters. He says, even economists given to cost-benefit analysis warn against completely ending... That's the wrong quote. How did that get there? Okay, so I'm going to read you the quote. He says, even economists...
Let's try the next one.
No, the next one is another quote. No. He says, even economists who do cost-benefit analysis warn against completely ending resettlement, because that would allow voters to forget about far-away misery, he says, making it politically more difficult for governments to support victims of war and starvation abroad. So they therefore, he says, recommend admitting a limited number of families for a heartbreaking and mind-softening illustration of distress and for a direct experience of gratefulness. So that gratefulness can be considered as intricately bound up with the conventional economic cost-benefit analysis. And that's indeed what Strix gets into. He says costs do matter, and precisely in rich countries, and they easily turn into a political issue. He says under optimistic conditions or assumptions, the fiscal costs of integration may be recovered at a later time once immigrants have jobs and pay taxes. The question is how long that takes. Upfront, the investment, according to him, must in any case be significant and higher than the fiscal costs per capita of unemployed citizens. This, he says, can give rise to popular resentment, especially if integration takes longer than promised. And balanced budget policies cause competition for scarce resources between immigrants and the local population, for instance, in housing. And I highlight that argument because I think it is a common trope in liberal discourse as such. The idea that too much migration will cause native resentment, animated by a presumed mixture of racism and anxiety over competition concerning housing, or more frequently mentioned, labor. And I think that in this line of argument, white rage is mobilized as a cost of migration. And the amount of migrants admitted is to be calibrated to keeping this rage in check. So the cost of migration is quite literally translated into a resentment that's conveniently attributed to the phantom of a white working class, as if the forgotten classes whose resentment would be aroused by migration are white. So this direct equivocation of migration with the cost of white rage over labor competition, I think, is liberalism's most subtle mixture of morality and money in the economy of migration. And the most rudimentary fact enacted in all of these accounts of migration as debt is the knowledge that migrants are people who might not have been here. This, I think, is the key point I want to make here. Migrants are people who might not have been here. Any data point entered into the administrative infrastructures of migration's accounting begins to, at the very least, configure a national demography in which migration didn't have to happen. So, as such, the post-war migration towards the metropoles of colonial rule, as well as scientific knowledge production, can only begin to be envisaged as the arrival of people that we, the natives, need not have taken into account if they hadn't crossed our borders. So in principally becoming a kind of additive act, say one person more is now among us, migration accounts for the loss of a world in which that person didn't have to be taken into account. And that is why migrants can be said to have a duty to integrate, or why one can speak of the costs of migration for society, or why society can only bear so much migration. As a thing to bear, migration is a modality of debt. And that debt is paid with every displacement by gentrification, every fall into poverty by job discrimination, every demand to integrate, every racialized asymmetry in education systems. All of these are reparations without repair. Reparations for the thing that is registered as migration. For the account and interpellation, hey you, migrant. And that becomes, of course, most visible in the case of those who are called economic migrants, where this debt kind of appears as a crime. But the genealogy of migration that I've sketched here really means that coding some migrants as economic should not blind us to the logic of the economy of migration as such, which is the economy of debt. And my question to scholars of migration, to conclude here, is simply this: why be invested in that logic? Why not explore the many ways in which coexistence might be done otherwise with less violence? So I hope to have given some impetus, if only some irritation maybe, towards redirecting us towards these questions. Thank you.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. I've been wondering from the start, because, I focus on Polish people who emigrated from Poland. And when we talk about those who left, also the standard scenario is that they could have been here, now they're not. But a lot of times, the countries from which people emigrate also look at them like, okay, so they left, but they should have been here and they should have been paying taxes and taking care of our country instead of going abroad. So I was wondering, what do you think, how that does fit or not? Because that would mean that those people that left Poland would be indebted to Poland because leaving, and to the country to which they arrived because they arrived there and they are migrants there. It's one thing. But another thing is that there was a talk recently about Eurostars and people who are very well qualified. And also, when people from Europe would move to Africa or other countries, actually this debt idea is exactly the reverse, because they're expected to be cherished for the fact that they decided to grace the country with their presence. So I was wondering, what are your thoughts on that and whether they fit into your idea?
Yeah, I guess that is precisely why the whole economy of migration is very much something that shows the continued existence of global color lines. So the fact that a wealthy European migrant going to Africa is not counted on the debt side, you could say, but is counted as an asset, is precisely what indicates that migration is born the moment colonial empires diminish and now have to deal with the effects of mobility across global color lines. So indeed, the story that I've been telling you is very much a European, maybe a Western or a Northern story, because I guess it also goes for the Americas. but it cannot be simply reversed. And as for immigration, the interesting point is exactly that the whole question of the whole figure of the migrant as someone who can be an immigrant or an immigrant, that is precisely the new thing. That is precisely what starts to emerge in the late 19th century. At the moment when empires start to diminish and start to have to deal with people who cross borders, and that necessarily has a consequence that they now also have to count their own people going elsewhere in the same accounting. So now what were formerly colonial settlers have to be counted indeed as immigrants. So this is indeed precisely the moment immigrants and immigrants both become this new thing that is a migrant, that is indeed the moment when these logics of debt start to play out. But they play out in racialized ways, and therefore Europeans going to Africa are not necessarily counted in those ways. There are all kinds of qualifications to be made because obviously there are similar logics going on, for instance, in South Africa, where white farmers are considered a drag on the actual native population. So I think for each country there are local inflections, there are national inflections to this. Also national inflections to the ways in which race works. I no doubt you will immediately recognize that race works differently in Poland than it works in the UK or in France. So there are asymmetrical ways in which that works, but indeed the consequence of the invention of the migrant is that now also natives who go elsewhere have to be entered into the same logics, but asymmetrically so. So the demand for some kind of repair of the costs of migration are not the same for everybody. Of course, when in the Netherlands, when Polish workers move to the Netherlands, they are very much part of this logic. They're very much considered in these economic terms. Also in terms of the potential benefits, of course, but also they're also seen to send remittances to Poland, for instance. So they are also seen to contribute to the Polish economy, right? So there are all these complex ways in which this accounting is done. But it can only be done by identifying some people as migrants, as people who might not have been here. And the only way to do that is to, at the same time, have this as an alternative sort of bookkeeping, what the nation would have been if the migrants hadn't come. That's the difference that migration is said to make. And that some people are then asked to make up for.
I have two questions. Probably the simpler one first, and the second one, my colleagues are going to think I've gone completely bonkers, but I'm going to risk it anyway. The first one is, do you think the idea of transnationalism is in any way an answer to your query and to what you think is wrong with migration studies? Obviously, it doesn't influence the statistics we collect, but it is the thought of being in two places and in two societies at the same time and actually not leaving the place that perhaps. That's the first question. And the second question, I've been thinking for some time about human and animal migration, and this is the first moment when somebody else mentions that as well, that's why I risk it. It seems to me that certain migration theories, human migration theories, fit animals' migration as well. I don't know about birds, but for example, dolphins. They do go somewhere else, find some better source of food, come back to tell their colleagues and get them.
sometimes they act in a way as to not let the others know, pulling up the ladder. And there are a number of examples I find like that. So do you think if we went into that direction and made the line between human migration and animal migration less clear, would we be benefiting our research in any way?
One more question, yeah? Or we have one more? Just a comment.
Thank you. Something a little bit follow-up after Dominika. My name is Karolina Sobczak-Szyc. I am dealing a little bit with environmental migration. But here, one thing that, just a follow-up, what I usually say to my students, or in general, and even also regarding the environmental migration, so caused by changes or fluctuations of the weather or environment and so on, it's that mobility actually is something what is natural, and immobility is something what was created when states came up to be real. Okay.
Should I collect more questions, or would you like, because...
Yeah, you can collect one more question, because these are difficult questions.
I don't know if it's really a question or maybe rather a comment. I'm just a simple economist, and I have to say I'm not sure if I managed to follow everything. So the point is, as for me, there is a lot of criticism regarding the economics of migration, and it's well taken. It regards, for example, assumptions, particularly in the case of the basic models, as the question of to how extent economics is able capturing non-material costs and benefits of migration. There's also the issue of the privatization of the sphere of migration. By the way, this is, I guess, what Branko Milanovic had in mind when this is the quote you presented. But as for me, at least the language of economics is kind of neutral. Language of economics. It's not the same how, for example, outcomes of various studies are being presented than in public debates. That's another story. But the language of economics is kind of neutral. And now, okay, so maybe it's a question. So what do you think, if the approach you presented, does it make the issue easier or rather more complicated? Because, for example, if we just introduce the concept of debt, as for me, it makes the whole story far more normative from the very beginning. And as economists, I'm not sure if it's easier or just the opposite. So it's just my point.
Yeah. So I think we differ on the issue of whether economics is a neutral language. Partly also, I mean, maybe economics is a neutral language, but it's set in a world which it tends to accept. So I started out with the example of the physicists who would, come to this room and say, okay, there are people here and tables and chairs, and we would say, well, can you go beyond that? What are these things made of? Are they made of atoms or whatever? And I think the same applies to many social scientists who have indeed, I guess, to make things way more complex. To not simply say, as an economist, okay, my language is neutral, so give me your data. Okay, you have nation states, you have people going from one nation to the other. Okay, now I can...
They do not talk about nation states, that's the point.
Well, so, okay, but they ultimately depend on the registration of some people as migrants. Otherwise, there is no cost of migration at all to be calculated. Right? The acceptance of that, to me, is something that I certainly would like to complexify a whole lot more. So maybe, there would be a different role for the economy of migration if we were to conceptualize migration differently. But my main interest is simply in saying, how can we have a scientific discipline that deals with migration if this very notion of migration is not, if we don't really actually go into the ways in which migration is made as a social phenomenon. if we accept that migration involves people moving from one country to another, we didn't start soon enough. We accept that whole constellation of the world, which is precisely what we should be researching if you want to understand how a phenomenon that some people start to call migration occurs. And it occurs under very specific historical consequences. So after the demise of colonial empires, etc. So we have to understand, I guess, why migration is born at that moment, and why it really is an anachronism to speak of the migration of people in the 15th century. Similar to the way in which it's an anachronism to say that Rembrandt, the famous Dutch artist, was an artist. He was not. He was a craftsman. And he didn't think of himself as an artist. So that's the social phenomenon of art is born in the 18th, 19th century. The social phenomenon of migration is born in the very late and early 20th century, and under specific historical conditions. And so that also means that there is a difference, I guess, with the dolphins, which, is a very interesting example. I wrote another paper together with Rogier van Rekem where we discuss identification and borders and in the context of migration. And there we make a comparison between humanoid dispersal, the out of Africa theory, and migration. And the basic difference is that in order to have migration, you have to have an international system of nation states. So this is precisely why it's important to not equate migration to mobility. Mobility is, as the other speaker suggested, is something that has always been there. But it's under very specific consequences that certain forms of mobility, not all, but certain forms of mobility, get to be registered as migration. And that doesn't happen with the dolphins. Dolphins do not cross national boundaries. They cannot cross national boundaries. They are in a completely different topology. So and I guess that's also why transnationalism is sort of still in this logic, but it is also an indication that something is problematic to this logic. So there have been all kinds of ways in which concepts have been devised to deal with this, to deal with this containing this world of nation states that clearly aren't as bounded as they claim to be. And I guess that transnationalism is one of those concepts. Another concept nowadays is super diversity, for instance. These are all ways of I guess these are all admissions of migration studies that something is sort of rotten at the core of migration studies, but there are attempts to work around that. But they still, ultimately, as you said, it's still based on counting people as migrants. So they still have to tie into that core logic that's there, rather than analyzing how this phenomenon of migration came into the world and what is required for it to remain into the world. Not only to remain as a topic of public controversy, but also as a topic of policy, of politics, and simply as an infrastructure of its registration. To me, a migration studies would research that, would research the ways in which it's possible for some people to be counted as migrants. Simply because the fact that people move from one country to another doesn't make them migrants. Many people are counted as migrants who never moved to another country. They were born in some European country. They're counted as migrants because their parents were migrants. So mobility as such doesn't have anything to do with migration. And those are the kind of things that I think warrant more study in migration studies.
I will allow myself also to ask a question. I was wondering whether, a bit in line of what you just said, the figure of the migrant, or basically a person who is called the migrant, doesn't experience actually what you experience basically when you cross social boundaries. Yes, you don't have to be a migrant. So within a society, Because a lot of the things you have mentioned, when I thought about someone who, for example, is a so-called internal migrant, yes, might experience as well, but also someone who changes, whatever, has suddenly has a higher education, while his parents have, they have also very often to prove that, you know, they're grateful and to prove that they deserve to be in that milieu, for example. Yes, so there are aspects that speak to me that are much broader here than the figure of the migrant is part of it.
May have an additional comment, because in fact we are in perfect place to discuss these issues you raised, because since the very beginning of the Center of Migration Research, we decided to look at migration or mobility as a really complex social process. So we fully agree, I guess most of us with you, that we should look much deeper into the complexity of, you know, the drivers and also outcomes of migration. But then, and I'm not feeling comfortable in the role of defender of economics, but I'm not sure if we're just talking about whom we should defend, so define as migrant, and when we're just talking about the registration. As for me, this is not economic issue really. You know, what economists do, they just deal with mobility, really, not that much of migration. Then we have, of course, political sciences mostly, and this is what brings this additional input. So I'm not sure that, you know, economics is an issue here, but I can be wrong, of course. Okay, so to be frank, when I do my analysis, for me, quite often it's not an issue if we talk about mobility or migration. Mm-hmm. In particular context, of course, it does matter, but not always.
No, I believe you there, but I also think that there are all these I mean, economists are very fond of comparing national economies. You know, ultimately, the mobility you're talking about is being attributed. It's mobility from here to there, for instance. In the same way, there's a longer version of this story that I've just written with Rogier van Rekem, where we actually go into the emergence of the economy a bit further. You know, as the anthropologist Timothy Mitchell has shown, the notion of an economy emerges in the late 1930s. Before that, nobody talked about economy, a national economy. So, but after that, and it's sort of parallel to the ways in which the registration of some people as migrants coming from here, going to there, emerges. So I guess that these things actually emerge in tandem, because what Timothy Mitchell says in that book, it's called Rule of Experts, he says that the national economy emerges precisely to make up for the disappearance of empire, and the world had to be reorganized into national economies. So I mean, we can have a longer discussion about this, but I would say that yes, you were interested in mobility, but at all the points where your data are delimited, there the national comes in, and there are boundaries at work.
Can I add something, because I just put on this quite important. Because, you know, for many years at DCMR, we used to study also those forms of migration that escape registration. So for us, it was very natural just to look at mobility, at people crossing various borders, including social borders, and not to focus that much on registration. So that's why, for us, it's quite natural what you are saying. So we should not be that much focused on this kind of issues. Maybe this is the dissonance here. But this is because of Poland, because this is of particular ways of mobility in this part of the world, I guess.
Yeah, on that issue, by the way, which also relates to Marta's question, I think that's really interesting. I mean, the way you talked about it reminds me of Bourdieu's analyses of people having to negotiate all kinds of social boundaries, and of indeed, feeling not quite at place, having to be grateful, etc. Bourdieu himself tremendously struggled with that, obviously. You know, that, I mean, it explained the ways in which he could sometimes lash out, and you know, because he always felt that he was not really accepted where he was. So that that kind of demand for gratitude also can lead to a certain resentment, I guess.